Good morning to you. I want to thank the musicians today. You may have noticed as they changed in the melody, the count changed. And I find that very difficult to do, so I am overawed by what you were able to do this morning with all that. Of course, I appreciate all our musicians because music is what sets the tone for us. But this changing count like that, that's why they don't let me sing in the choir. I can't do that. Well, as you heard, our new pastor, Peter Choi, or Pastor Peter or Pastor Choi, however you want to determine it, is going to be here next Sunday. So I pray that we will welcome him and reach out to him and love him. At conference, the memorial service pastor was a Korean pastor, and he did a great job, didn't he? When God comes and you know that God has come, isn't that just great? Huh? Well, maybe you want to rethink that. When I read to you Elijah, before I read this, let me go back and fill in the chapters before, just a little bit. Ahab was the king of Israel. Now you may remember that there had been a civil war, and Israel, the nation Israel, had been split into two. The northern kingdom was called Israel. That was 9 tribes. And then there was the tribe of Judah, which was in the southern part and called the southern kingdom. Now, there were a couple of other tribes that were across the river, and somehow they didn't seem to count. But anyway, there's 2 different places, and Ahab is the king of Israel, the northern kingdom. Ahab was married to Jezebel. Actually, Jezebel was the ruler of the kingdom. She called the shots. And they had begun to worship Baal. And Elijah went and said to Ahab, what I want you to do is bring all your Baal prophets over here on the mountain, and we'll find out who really is God. So they built 2 altars, and they stacked them with wood, and they butchered a bull and laid a bull on each of the altars. And Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, and you may remember the story, I'm just probably refreshing your memory, but he said, what's wrong? Why is Baal not answering? Maybe he's asleep, wake him up. So they danced all around the altar and cried and prayed, and nothing happened. And then Elijah cried out, maybe he's on vacation. Do some more. So they did more. They even cut themselves and did all sorts of ritual, and nothing happened. And finally at noon, which was the time of the noon offering, Elijah said, okay, it's my turn now. So what I want you to do is pour water on the altar. So they did. And he said, that's not enough. Pour some more on. They poured it on. 3 times he did that. The wood is saturated. There was so much water that even around the altar in the little ditch was full of water. So then Elijah began to pray, Lord, show them who really is God. And I take it that it was a lightning bolt, because lightning bolts, I understand the temperature is up into thousands of degrees. Anyway, the fire came down from heaven and consumed everything. The bull, the wood, even the rocks, and the water was dried up. And then Elijah did something very different. Elijah had all the prophets, 900 of them, slain, killed, butchered, right there. Ahab didn't know what to do. So what does he do? He goes back and he tells Jezebel, this is what Elijah did. Now Jezebel is where the story begins. Let me read some of this to you. Actually, this is part of the election text. The gospel is part of the election text, and we're going to use both of them. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent messengers to Elijah, saying, so may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not take the life as one of them by this time tomorrow. Then he, being Elijah, then he was afraid, and he arose and went out for his life and came to Beersheba, which is in the land of Judah. And he left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, it is enough now, Lord. Take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers. And he lay down and he slept under the broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at the head a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. And he ate and he drank and he lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise and eat. The journey will be too great for you. So he arose and ate and drank, and with the strength of the food went 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he came to a cave and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him and said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thy altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, go forth and stand upon the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind rent the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind came an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, what are you doing, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken thy covenant and thrown down thy altars and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even only I, am left, and they seek my life. And the Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive there, you shall anoint Hazael, the king over Syria. These are more of the words of God for the people of God. So you heard what happened, and Jezebel is set out to kill Elijah. Said he was afraid. He had every right to be afraid. I mean, those words, do not be afraid, sometimes do not ring very true, do they? Sometimes it's wise to be afraid. Jezebel was a dangerous woman. I mean, have you ever heard anybody naming their daughter Jezebel? No more than you've ever heard anybody name their sons Judas. I mean, there's reasons for that. Because a name carries a reputation. And this woman had a dangerous reputation. In fact, she is the one who led Ahab to bring Baal worship into the kingdom. Anyway, she is after Elijah for killing her prophets. And Elijah is, maybe the word terrified isn't too strong. In a dangerous situation, it's foolish not to be afraid. But that doesn't stop us from doing the action now, does it? So Elijah has a pity party. We read about where he goes down into the wilderness and he finds a broom tree and he lays down to sleep and he says to God, "Why don't you just take my life? I'm not any good anymore." Did you ever have a pity party? Come on, now be honest. Have you ever never felt sorry for yourself? Oh God, why does this happen to me? You know, pity parties are dangerous. They can lead to deep depression. I read in the newspaper the other day that the suicide rate in this nation has actually climbed in the last 3 or 4 years. And it's a sad thing. People are afraid. People have weird things done to them, bullying and all sorts of stuff. It's just like with Elijah. It doesn't always come from within. Sometimes it's stuff outside that affects us. And sometimes we have a pity party. Now, there is a cure for a pity party. And God's going to do it to Elijah in just a few minutes. Well, actually, it was a few days probably, but we don't have that kind of time. So Elijah gets up from his pity party and he's trucking on up toward the mountain of Horeb. And guess what? He runs smack dab into God. Now you would think, well, that's a great thing. I mean, that's God, that's his salvation. Well, think about that a minute. He finally finds him, but God gives him a job to do. And that is the cure for self-pity, is to find somebody else who needs help and do it. To find a job to do and do it. God has something for him, but he's not ready for that yet. God has a little bit more work to do on Elijah. So he sends this wind. Now, you've probably been watching the news and you saw the great tornadoes out west. How even cars were flipped over and over. Houses completely shattered, moved off their foundations. I mean, that is some wind. Well, this is the wind that Elijah experienced. He's standing there in the mouth of his cave. He's watching all of this. You can believe that he's terrified. He's probably more terrified now than he was when Jezebel was after him. Then the wind dies down. And before long, here comes the earthquake. And I can just imagine that some of the rocks in the ceiling of the cave begin to fall down. There's another terrifying incident, the power of God working and shaking the mountain. And then God sends the fire, burns up everything on the mountain, all the trees. You saw that on the news too, all the big fires that consumed everything. Where'd you come from? It's a terrifying time for Elijah. Do you understand how terrific all this stuff happening right before his eyes is? It says that God was not there. All of a sudden, after the wind, after the earthquake, and after the fire, everything becomes completely silent. There's no sound. You may have experienced a place with no sound, so quiet. And all of a sudden, there is this still, small voice. Elijah, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? When you were young, and when you had done something naughty and you knew it, right? And one of your parents said to you, Gene, what are you doing? You know darn good and well they knew what you were doing. So why did they say, what are you doing? Well, it was to call your attention, to pay attention, and take responsibility for what you were doing. No more yelling. I promise I'm not going to yell at you again. You see what it does. He gave Elijah a job to do. Elijah, I want you to go and do this job. I want you to go back out of the wilderness, back out into the world. And I have this job I want you to do. It's important. That was Elijah's salvation. That is what got him out of the pity party. Now he knows who to be afraid of. This power of God is far more powerful than the power of Jezebel. Because that's exactly what God was doing, was a demonstration of power. I will show you who to be afraid of. And since we're talking about fear, let's talk about that. Jesus said so many times, it was one of his favorite expressions, fear not, don't be afraid. And what he meant was don't be afraid of God. You see, this demonstration of power is not against you, it is for you. It is the power that is given to us as the church to change the world. Do we use that power? Not so much, maybe. Not like it could be used. Speaking about fear, in the gospel reading, it says the people came out and saw what was going on. They saw the man who had been uncontrollable, in control, dressed, in his right mind, it said. And they were afraid. In fact, the real Greek says they were terrified. Why were they afraid? I got to thinking about that the other day. Why were they afraid? So often when people who were outside people came in contact with Jesus, it said they were afraid. They were afraid, number one, of his power. We don't like power that we have no control over. Do you remember? Some of you don't remember. There's a few of you who are old enough to remember the Cold War. After the atomic bomb, we were afraid. I remember people building bomb shelters. People were afraid of this new power, this nuclear power. Now, we don't fear it anymore, not so much anyway. But we do not like a power that is greater than ourselves, that we have no control over. Let's be honest about that. We don't like it. Maybe the other reason that they're afraid is because it will wreck their economy. You know, one of the things that really gripes me that I see happening today is people talking about all this environmental stuff and disregarding it because it might cost jobs. It might take away our economy. So you see, there's another fear that we have today. These people had fear of God because they couldn't control this. They couldn't control it any more than they could control this maniac man, this man filled with demons. No, the power of God, this power of wind and earthquake and fire, is the power that God has granted to us to use for his kingdom, to change the world, and we can do it. Well, you've heard the gospel. You've heard the story. Now listen to God, because he has something to say to you. He has something to do for you, and he has something to do to you. And as a side note, I'd like to go back to that gospel and talk about the man, because he said to Jesus after he had been healed, "Let me go with you, Lord." And Jesus said, "No, you go back home. You stay here. You go out into the world and tell the story." That becomes an essential part of this whole story, really, because the best evangelism I know is to simply tell the story. So many people over the years that I've been in ministry have said to me, "Well, I can't witness to people. I cannot be an evangelist." You don't have to be. All you have to do is tell the story. Somebody somewhere is going to have a problem, and they're going to be in front of you or beside of you, and they're going to say, "What am I to do?" Maybe they're having a pity party. And what you can say to them, if you say anything at all, sometimes just our life is our best story, but we can tell them what life was like before Jesus. And we can tell them what happened in the midst of that story. And now we can tell them what it's like now. No, I still have problems. No, things are not always perfect in my life. But one thing is perfect. Now I have a sense of serenity and peace that I never had before. And I have that because Jesus has become a part of my life. That anybody can say to anybody. It's not hard to tell your story. And when you tell your story, they will know exactly who you are, and they will know who Jesus is. So you have heard the words. Listen to them, for they are the word of God. Thanks be to God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We're going to sing 472.